This is the smell of the leftover tuna fish sandwich you left in your lunchbox over the weekend in a wimpy trash bag.
Wimpy, wimpy, wimpy!
Blech! And this is the smell of that same sandwich in a hefty, ultra-strong trash bag.
Hefty, hefty, hefty!
Ah, smell the difference? Hefty Ultra Strong has Arm & Hammer with continuous odor control, so no matter what's inside your trash, you can stay one step ahead of stinky. And for bigger jobs, try the superior strength of Hefty Large Black Bags.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of History You Didn't Know. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about North Carolina Governor Zebulon Vance. And Zebulon Vance, Chris, was someone I must admit to our audience that before we settled on looking at Vance for this episode, I really didn't know much about him.
Yeah, it's really fascinating when we go back and look at some of these individuals in the past. And the one thing that can be found is while we might be familiar with towns such as Zebulon and things of that nature, one thing through the research that we discovered is that North Carolina, during this period of time with Zebulon Vance, they loved him, they idolized him, and he's one of the top 5 figures, I think, in North Carolina in which people truly had great adoration for, even though he was complicated. And had some controversial history. I think if you look back during his period, you'll find that people saw him as a beloved leader.
Yeah, it's very easy for people to look at individuals such as Zebulon Vance and others from this time period as being one-dimensional. But we have to remember people are multidimensional, and you can paint a person in one way, but then there's always going to be things about them that don't necessarily fit that one-dimensional picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think above all that even Zebulon Vance knew that he wasn't perfect, but he tried to put his actions by the way that he treated the people of North Carolina. He always put them first, even above himself. And I think that there are some areas of Zebulon's life that are a little shady, and we could have some strong objections to. But then there's that other side of Zebulon in which we have a lot of praise for the way that he did treat the people of North Carolina. So it's this beautiful thing about history in which you have to understand that there are multiple dimensions, as you mentioned, about a person's life, and that we can't just look at one area, but we have to look at the person as a whole. And that's what we're going to do a little bit today.
Yeah, so we're going to introduce our audience to Zebulon Vance. Then we're going to get into some of his life and his career here in North Carolina. He's born in Buncombe County, which was about 12 miles north of Asheville, where he was born. He lived there with his mom and his father, of course, until his father's death in 1844. And he moved to Eastern Tennessee to attend Washington College. Now, he only is at Washington College about a year or so, and then his family moves to Asheville, and in 1850 he goes and he studies law, and then he goes and attends the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Don't believe he actually graduated from there. I think he just sort of attended there for a period of time. He becomes a lawyer. As a lawyer, he practices law in Asheville, and even there he was elected early on in his life as solicitor for Buncombe County. So he starts getting important positions in the public policy arena very early. And he's able to sort of advance a little bit in his practice of law, but it appears very early that politics was his passion. This is where he really wanted to be, was in the political sphere, in the political arena. So he comes into North Carolina politics as a Whig, sort of a Whig in the Henry Clay tradition, but he would eventually align himself, unfortunately, and we talk about things about him that, are a little dark, and this is one of those. He eventually aligns himself with the American Party. And if our listeners aren't familiar with the American Party, it's also known as the Know Nothing Party. And it was very anti-immigrant, very anti-Catholic. And it got the name Know Nothing Party because people who were associated with the party would often deny knowing anything about it. And he gets involved there, and he's going to serve in the state legislature here in North Carolina before being elected to Congress and he's going to serve there until 1861, Chris.
Yeah, and I think that's where things start to really develop for Zebulon Vance was in the spring of 1861. And, he had been serving, as you mentioned, in the House. But then in March, because of the turmoil that's going on between the southern states and the northern states, we see that Congress basically disbands. Abraham Lincoln has been inaugurated as president. We see that our nation is now in turmoil. And so Vance will basically come back home. And as he comes back home, there's an interesting thing that starts to identify who this man was. And what happens is he spends the first part of his trip home, say this is around, I think, maybe April of 1861, and he's trying to persuade North Carolinians to not follow what he labeled the crazy fanatics of South Carolina. So the South Carolinians are wanting to succeed. They're wanting to disband. They're wanting to remove themselves from the Union. And here is a person from North Carolina who's trying to persuade the state to stay in touch with the Union, to stay connected to the Union. And he really thought that he was going to win this argument. He thought that people were listening to him. He thought that it was making sense. And we have to recognize that, yes, North Carolina was a slave state, but it did not have the large Black populations of the states that were further on in the South. They didn't have the huge plantations that maybe South Carolina had. Zebulon Vance, he understood how to relate to people. He talked their language. He was very gifted in Shakespeare. He knew the Bible, but he knew Shakespeare and he knew the Bible because he knew how to relate to people. And he knew that they were ordinary folks, and he wanted to speak to them in a style in which they could understand, and that they would, he was witty, and he always had a story, and he would love to tell stories to help make his point. And the point that he makes, he's actually giving a speech one day, and he is encouraging people to make sure that they will support the Union. Don't go and join the fanatics of South Carolina and everything. I mean, he's really, he even in one of his letters talks about that his hand was in the air, and he was just adamant about staying strong for the Union. And then he heard that President Lincoln had just ordered for shots to be fired on Fort Sumter, and that 75,000 volunteers had just been called on by President Lincoln to join the Army. And he said, at that moment, I knew that I could no longer support the wishes of the Union, and therefore I decided to put all of my attention towards supporting secession, supporting the Confederate movement. And that would basically lead to May, when the legislature will pass the Ordinance of Succession, which many people might not be familiar with, but North Carolina actually became the last state to join the Confederacy in the fight in the Civil War. So what's interesting is that was his political motivation, but then he didn't just talk politics. He actually goes and even registers to serve in the Confederate Army.
Yeah, and he doesn't just simply serve in the Confederate Army and goes and fights for the Confederacy. He receives a captain's commission there in the Confederate Army, and it is a dramatic change from a man who was, earlier on really opposing secession, and then the issues at Fort Sumter caused a complete 180 in his thinking. In 1862, so he's not going to stay fighting for the Confederacy long. In 1862, he moves yet again to a different political party. And one thing we're going to see about Zebulon Vance is that he does change allegiances on numerous occasions, at least political allegiances, throughout this time. In 1862, he accepts the Conservative Party's nomination to run for North Carolina governor. And he runs against a Confederate Party candidate, a guy called William Johnson. And Vance is going to defeat William Johnson, and he's going to become I guess, the first governor of North Carolina or the first elected governor of North Carolina when North Carolina is part of the Confederacy. And as governor of North Carolina during this time, he's going to work to provide North Carolina troops with the resources that they need, the necessities they need to be successful in the battlefield. And he's also going to work, you mentioned his ability to relate well to people. He's also going to work a lot to get civilians the things they need, make sure food chain keeps going and all of that. And of course, Chris, it's going to be during all this that he's actually going to have a run-in with the Confederate government, the government of Jefferson Davis. So, he, like you said earlier, he is a North Carolinian first and foremost. And if there's something that's not benefiting North Carolinians, he's going to push back regardless of who he's pushing back against.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that this transition that he's doing of politician, and then he goes and fights in the battlefield. And you're right, his commission does not last long. But even in that short amount of time, I think there were two battles that his group participated in. One being, or the last one being, I think, the concluding battle of the 7 days, the 7 days battle. But even in that short time, the soldiers, they saw a man who cared more about his comrades than about himself, that he was willing to put himself in harm's way to ensure that they were successful. But he also had that, once again, that way of talking to them, to letting them know that everything was going to be okay, that everything was going to be fine. Going back to that 7 days campaign, which was, just kind of not really what the Confederacy was looking for. They knew that they were in trouble. Zebulon's group that he was leading knew that it was going to be a very, very difficult day. But I thought it was interesting that as Vance was leading that regiment up the hill to go in and join the assault, that he saw this rabbit that kind of like jerked out in front of them and started going the opposite way. And basically at that moment, getting ready to go into battle, Zebulon Vance says, "You go at it, Cottontail." And he actually quoted, he said, "If I had no more reputation to lose than you, I'd run too." And it was in that moment where the men saw a leader, but they also saw someone who kind of put them in ease and allowed them to go and to attack. And yes, this was not a great success story for the Confederates. But what happened is that the Tar Heel soldiers, they would always go back to this day, and they would never forget the example that he would show in battle. And then, as you mentioned, he was so interested and making sure that the soldiers, even after he left the army, that they had clothes, that they had shoes, that they had blankets. He got into trouble with the Confederate government because he said, "I am more interested in my people having something to eat, having something to wear, than I am in forming factories that are producing cloth for the soldiers instead of my people at home." And we actually owe the textile revolution of North Carolina, if you will, that comes because of Zebulon Vance. Now, I know that the textile has declined in North Carolina, but it was at one point the major production facilities in North Carolina. And that is because of Zebulon Vance and his willingness to ensure that women and children had opportunities to work and to have provisions. And so I think that we have to really pay attention to that aspect as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a man who was always, like you said, putting North Carolina first. Some of the issues that brought him in direct conflict with the Confederate government, one of them was over Virginia soldiers serving in North Carolina. He was not a fan of that. He had issues with their conscription policies, and also the suspension of the right of habeas corpus, which the Confederacy wanted to do. So this is a man who is he's very pro North Carolina. He's very pro the average person, the average soldier. And so in 1864, when he's going to run for re-election as governor, at this particular time, it's important to remember the governorship of North Carolina was a 2-year term. It was not a 4-year term like it is today. So in 1864, he's actually going to go against William Holden. Now, he and Holden had been allies until Holden basically decides to get to become a part of a peace movement that included basically, I guess, pardoning draft dodgers or something to that effect. And a very bitter campaign follows. And Vance wins re-election here in North Carolina to serve yet again as governor of the state.
Yeah, and I think you're just talking over and over as we agree that Vance always looking out for what was best for the state of North Carolina, what was best for the citizens of North Carolina. You mentioned habeas corpus.
Yes.
And this was a huge deal that Abraham Lincoln, excuse me, had suspended. And, Zebulon Vance said, there is no way that I will allow any citizen of North Carolina to not be given the right of trial by jury, to give an equal protection of rights. You mentioned his love for the soldier and for the common man. There was a story of this individual who's he was a preacher, Reverend Graves, I believe was his name, and he had traveled legally across the lines, if you will, to go to New York to have a throat operation. And so he travels to New York, he gets this throat operation, and then he's heading home. And as he's heading home, he's talking to a Union officer about some of the things that were going on, some of the conditions in Richmond and different things of that nature. And there was this brigadier general of the Confederate Army who just happened to be in the same train and heard Reverend Graves talking to the other individual that was there, talking to the Union officer, if you will. And so the man actually goes to Reverend Graves's church, listens to the whole sermon, and then after Reverend Graves gives the sermon, basically arrests him and wants to try him for treason, brings him back to Richmond. Zebulon Vance hears about one of his citizens being arrested for treason and being put into this prison, and actually goes and tries to intercept the train taking him to prison. Can't do that. But then what he basically does is he goes to the mayor of Richmond and says, you will let this man go. I'm telling you, you will let this man go. And if you don't, then you'll have more to deal with than just the Union. You'll have to deal with me. And basically what happens is habeas corpus is upheld for this man. And Graves, instead of being hanged as a traitor, is actually brought back home and is able to resume his duty. So I think that's, once again, just another illustration. We could talk about the blockade, how he initiated a boat that was specifically designed to be a blockade runner. Why did he do that? Because he needed additional supplies for his people in North Carolina.
Right.
One last thing that I'll mention is that while he left the Civil War and then went to become a politician during the Civil War, he still made his way to the battlefield. He still would go to the battlefield and find where the North Carolina troops were. And he would give these speeches that these guys remembered. I mean, it was like the Gipper speech, right? I mean, it was that, let's go get them. And this is after, his foray in the battle. And even Robert E. Lee was so impressed with Vance's speeches that he would just be in awe and would ask him to give additional speeches. Now, that talks a little bit about how he cared for all aspects, if you will, of North Carolina.
Yeah, and it's not surprising that he does keep getting elected to office, whether it's governor or state legislature or even the federal legislature. He is a very popular person in North Carolina, and his actions there demonstrate why he is a popular person, a popular politician and leader here in the country. Now, in April of 1865, he is governor of North Carolina, and he learns that Confederate troops are going to evacuate Raleigh. And I think the reason they're going to evacuate Raleigh is there is a belief, if I'm not mistaken, that Sherman is coming to Raleigh and that he is going to that he is going to attack the city. Of course, they ultimately learn that's not going to happen. But under threat, now what does he do? He stays there in Raleigh and he makes sure that state records and military stores are transferred to places like Graham and Greensboro and Salisbury. And then a few days later, in an unprotected capital and Sherman's army on the way, he sends former governors David Swain and William Graham to open negotiations with the Union general. And he's there in Raleigh in an unprotected city. The Confederate troops have left the city, and he's there staying at the helm, even when it looks like his life may be in danger.
Yeah, he had sent his family back
Yeah.
home, I think, to Statesville, and he stayed there. And he actually has some communication with Sherman. And Sherman says, "Hey, listen, I'm not going to burn down Raleigh, although I don't know if you really want to trust his words, especially after we've seen what's happening in his march to sea."
Right.
But Sherman is not 100% satisfied of that response. And so after doing everything that you mentioned as far as preparing the state and securing all the files, he does decide to go back home to Statesville.
Yep.
And on his 35th birthday, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, does have him arrested. What's interesting is they arrest him and don't really tell him why they're arresting him.
Yeah, and he stays in jail for a little while there in D.C., even though he's not really sure why he's there, or a lot of other people aren't really sure why he's there. No reason was ever given for his imprisonment. I think he was in prison like 47 days, and
Yeah.
no charges are ever brought against him.
No charges ever brought against him. And an interesting story, while he was in prison up in Washington, some of his friends who were on the other side, who were in the Union, would come and visit him. Former congressman would come and say hello to him while he was in prison. And the story is told of one senator from Ohio who visited Vance, and he basically asked Vance, he said this, he said, quote, "Vance, what was the matter of your fellows down south? I don't get the hang of it." And Vance looked at the senator and said, quote, "I don't either." And then clutching his neck, he said, "But I'm about to get the hang of it," because he really thought that they were going to kill him. But he did not fear what was going to come, because he knew that he had done everything that he could. Ultimately, of course, Edwin Stanton brings him to his office on July the 6th and says, "You are free to go."
Yeah.
And Vance says, "Well, are you going to give me an apology? Are you going to explain?" And Edwin just said, "Get out of here."
Yeah.
Just head on back. And so Vance heads back to North Carolina, where he continues to provide help and other things for the state. I do think that we need to touch base on maybe his relationship with people of color in North Carolina, because we've talked a lot about how he did care for people, and in today's society, there's a lot who look at Zebulon Vance and they read a few things that he did say, and they look at a few aspects. And yes, it is true that this was one of his weakest areas, in which we see that he had some unfortunate views when it came to slavery and things of that nature. But what we do know is that in 1865 and on, and actually a little even later, I think it was 1876 when he becomes governor again. I think in 1876 that his main focus is improving education, but not just improving education, but especially improving education with Black individuals. And I think that you have to look at both sides of that also.
Yeah, and I think it's important when you talk about someone like Zebulon Vance and others, is to always put them in their historical context and allow them to evolve with the times. Allow them to change with the times. Don't just put them in one part and say, well, that reflected their entire life. But these people do evolve. They did change, just like we evolve, and we change over time with circumstances and situations in our lives. Now, it's interesting, he was released by Edwin Stanton, and I wanted to go back to that point. I want our listeners, if they haven't done so, to go back and listen to our 2 episodes on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, because we do talk about the relationship there between Andrew Johnson and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and all that went down there. Now, speaking of President Andrew Johnson, Zebulon Vance is actually going to apply for amnesty under Andrew Johnson's proposal of amnesty for former Confederates after the war, of course. And he's going to receive amnesty in 1867. He is going to be pardoned on March 11, 1867, for his involvement, of course, in the Civil War. during his time, I guess, as a soldier and, of course, as governor of a Confederate state.
Excuse me. Yeah. And, I guess I want to close kind of my part here with maybe just two quick stories on Zeb Vance to finalize it, because I just think it encompasses this whole view of Zeb Vance. We know that Zeb Vance was married. He was married to a shy, precocious Protestant young lady for quite some time. But then later on in his life, I don't remember if she had died or they had a fallen out. I don't remember that part of it, but he remarries. And this time he remarries and he married a Catholic from Lexington, Kentucky. And someone said, well, Zebulon, what are you thinking marrying a Catholic when you are in one of the most Protestant states in the country? What were you thinking? And I just thought it was funny, his response. This is a quote from him. He said, quote, well, I have tried rum and I have tried rebellion. So I thought I would give Romanism a try also.
Yeah, I mean, you think about him, and I almost hate to make this comparison, but I'm going to. You think about him, and you mentioned the Gipper earlier. His ability to tell stories, to sort of put people at ease, and to bring humor into a situation that could otherwise be very tense, reminds me a little bit of someone like Ronald Reagan or even Abraham Lincoln, who told a lot of stories and was somewhat self-effacing at times.
Absolutely. And I think, the final story that I have about Zebulon Vance speaks to that specifically. And it actually comes from a wonderful look at the Battle of Fort Fisher right down in Wilmington. And, there was this great fear that the Union forces were going to close the ports of Wilmington. They were going to take over. And Zebulon knew that if they shut this down, he was going to lose all of the goods that was going to be able to help his people in North Carolina to be able to survive. And so basically, Zeb issues this proclamation. And I love what he says. And I think that this just kind of sums up who he was. And I'll leave our listeners with this. He said this, and I quote, all good people who may be able to stand behind breastworks and fire a musket of all ages and conditions, rally at once to the defense of their country and hurry to Wilmington. Your governor will meet you at the front and will share the worst with you. I just think that speaks to a man who demonstrated it in politics as well as on the battlefield, who understood the beauty and the sacredness of ensuring that the state of North Carolina would not only prosper, but that its citizens would be able to find success. And yes, he was imperfect. And yes, there's a lot that we might not agree with. But the one thing that we can respect is here's a man who used wit, but who used love and compassion to ensure that the state of North Carolina would be better off after this terrible war than it was before.
Yeah, and after the war, in his final days, of course, he goes back and is elected to the U.S. Senate. He's elected again as governor of North Carolina, and then he goes back to the Senate again. And he dies there while he's in the Senate. And unfortunately, his time in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, is not really productive in the sense that we don't really have any legislation that's specifically tied to him, any important legislation that's specifically tied to him. And he's going to pass away on April 14 in 1894 of a stroke here in North Carolina. And I think, like you said, he's a very complicated person. He has some dark parts to him. His views of African Americans and slavery and his involvement in the Know Nothing Party. But there's a lot about him that's to be commended, and a lot about him that we can look back on and thank him for. as being a great leader in a very difficult time and a very difficult situation. So, Chris, I have enjoyed this episode. I hope our listeners anyway enjoyed the episode as well. Thank you for all the research you did and the stories you brought to the table about Zebulon Vance and the many things he did for the people of North Carolina. If our listeners want to contact us, you can always contact us by email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And we look forward to talking to you again soon.